This is a recorded webinar on basic prevention and de-escalation strategies adapted from the work of Dr. Colvin. The purpose of this recorded webinar and PowerPoint review is to provide you with some very basic prevention and de-escalation strategies. This is all being done for you under the regulations of emergency safety intervention, which requires that all staff have a very basic understanding of some prevention and de-escalation strategies. So this particular slide is an interaction between a teacher and a student, we'll say, whose name is Jason, but certainly replace this with any name that you wish. Certainly as you see the interaction taking place here, you'll notice that there's a conversation around an assignment. Now, obviously, in this interaction, you can see as the teacher and the student began to interact, that things escalated very quickly. And so likely in your minds, depending on your experience in the classroom or as an administrator, likely you can relate with some kind of situation where things escalated. And in some situations, perhaps the teacher could have done some things differently, and certainly the student could have done some things differently. What we will work through today is the research from Colvin on the 7 phases of acting out in the classroom. And in doing so, talk about each of those 7 phases, what that looks like, and what teachers or adults can do to hopefully prevent or de-escalate something like this scenario, which results in a student pulling away, glaring, and raising the fist as if to strike. So take just a moment and kind of think about this chart. And what you'll see is on the left-hand side, this idea of ever-increasing behavioral intensity, and along the bottom, the idea of time and behavioral intensity over time. So if, for example, and just think to yourself, which of these types of cycles would you identify yourself with the most? If you are this red line, and if you look at this chart, you'll notice that in a very short amount of time, your behavioral intensity would escalate. You would remain at an intense level for an extended period of time and then slowly taper off or de-escalate and recover. If you are a green, if you would identify yourself with green, it would take a long amount of time for you to finally peak. But in doing so, not even at a very intense level, and then you quickly de-escalate and recover. If you look at the lighter blue line, the intensity doesn't ever really become intense. Over a long period of time, there's a peak, and then right back to that flatter level of intensity. And then the darker blue in the middle shows gradual behavioral intensity rising to a peak point over time. That peak occurs very quickly and then back through de-escalation. So this type of cycling or these phases are different in all humans. And what we will focus on for the rest of this time is what does that look like typically from a student in those 7 phases. So according to Colvin's research, there's this idea of how we as adults and certainly as educators can manage the cycle of acting out in the classroom by understanding that there are, according to Colvin's research, 7 phases that students go through, and how we as adults can help to prevent peak being reached. Certainly if peak is reached, this is where the crisis planning would come into play, the use of seclusion or restraint under ESI. But we're going to walk through each of these 7 phases, again, with the goal of providing you some very basic de-escalation and prevention strategies around the research of Colvin. So the first phase is known as calm, and in the calm phase, what we would generally see is that the student is very cooperative, accepts corrective feedback, follows directives, will even set personal goals, ignore most distractions, and accept praise. From a teaching standpoint and strategy wise, teachers are able to, in this phase, generally teach procedures while students are calm, uh, things that may be done to rehearse entering the classroom, engagement activities to get students working immediately, teaching students how to ask for help, practicing bathroom procedures. So as you can see in this calm phase, much work can be done, much rehearsing can be done around procedures, practices, and getting students into a routine or a flow of work. Within the 7 phases, the next that may occur is this idea of a trigger, and this would take the student out of the calm phase. Some examples of triggers or unresolved conflicts may be repeated failures in the classroom, academically, socially, emotionally. May occur frequent corrections provided by peers or the teacher if there are interpersonal conflicts among students or the teacher, the stress of timelines, and if there are low rates of positive reinforcement in the classroom. All of these, and certainly more, but all of these could be the source or the trigger for coming out of that calm phase. Under Colvin's research and in environments of positive behavior supports and de-escalation and prevention, there is an emphasis on providing as much positive reinforcement as possible in class, and certainly at the trigger phase, being able to increase that rate of positive reinforcement is critical. Some strategies at the trigger phase, should a student be experiencing one of these unresolved conflicts, is this idea of reframing or making diffusing statements, statements that help you stay personal with the student and not personalizing the problem. Other items to consider really aren't verbal at all. This idea of proximity, how close you are physically to the student, and certainly body language from an adult. Those nonverbal cues or behaviors, and it's important to recognize when a student needs space. So if a student is experiencing a trigger, trying to diffuse that trigger by reframing some comments that positively reinforce what the student is doing, not personalizing the problem, and paying very close attention to your proximity and your body language, and recognizing again when that student needs space. However, that student may go into the next phase, which is agitation. And in agitation, the student will exhibit an increase in unfocused behavior and become off task. You may see frequent start and stop on tasks, perhaps out of the seat, talking with others, or potentially social withdrawal. And so strategies from the educator's standpoint, be it the teacher, paraeducator, other support in the classroom, maybe taking that student into a non-academic task, perhaps something in the classroom, just to give that student something else to think about momentarily, and perhaps that then could re-engage that student and prevent further agitation or acceleration, which is the next phase. Providing them with successful engagements and building some behavioral momentum, so maybe shorter, easier to complete tasks, both academically or perhaps in the classroom, keeping in mind still this idea of proximity and body language, and not just what is said to a student, but how that is said and how spacing is utilized between the adult and the student. It might just be appropriate for that student to take a break, perhaps step out into the hall and grab a drink of water if that's permissible and a part of your school's plan. Provide the student with reasonable choices as options. Giving choices helps to reduce anxiety. So again, if a student is in this agitation phase and is exhibiting some of these behaviors, having a toolkit ready in your mind of some different options that you could make available to a student to maybe take a break from that non-academic task and see if maybe that de-escalation or prevention of going into the next phase could take place. The next of the 7 is acceleration. This would be obviously after agitation, and the student begins to accelerate. The student will display very focused behavior, but it will be provocative, high intensity, potentially threatening and very personal. And so at this point, the student is accelerating rapidly to a peak, which may require and likely will require the use of an emergency safety intervention. So at this time, if you notice this acceleration of student behavior, and it is very focused, intense, potentially threatening, and personal, it's important to keep the safety of everybody in the room in mind and begin thinking about what is the exit strategy should that student enter that peak phase or that crisis phase. How do we keep everybody safe? Generally, during acceleration, a student is not able to think rationally and they're unable to potentially exhibit self-control. So strategies in this acceleration phase are certainly to avoid using any escalating prompts like continuing to give directions, continuing to explain. From an adult standpoint, certainly maintaining calmness, showing respect, and just detaching yourself, perhaps state your position and just walk away. Don't engage in that back and forth, given that the student already is in this accelerated phase. It is intense, it is potentially threatening, it is very personal for the student. So just as the adult and modeling for others in the room, just being calm, showing respect, and detaching yourself may help that student come out of that phase. Certainly, if things continue to accelerate, the peak will be achieved, if you will, or reached. The student at this peak phase is generally out of control, could be physically aggressive, could be destroying property, could be inflicting harm to self, could be some hyperventilation involved. And at this point, when a student has peaked, this is where the crisis plan should be enacted or initiated. This may involve the use of restraint, may involve the use of seclusion based on your local plan of what to do. And with thinking about ESI and emergency safety intervention, one of those key components is the documentation, the reporting that must occur if restraint or seclusion is used, and the definition of the regulation of those is met. So being ready for this, the crisis plan, having that in place and ready, and being able to know, should a student enter this peak phase, who is doing what. Part of that may mean that you, as the teacher in the classroom or the para in the classroom, may need to clear the classroom for the safety of others. Depending on the length of the peak, de-escalation will be the next phase. In the beginning portion of de-escalation, students will display some confusion. There may be some withdrawal, some denial, blaming others, trying to minimize what the problem actually was. But those are things you might see in the student as he or she enters this de-escalation. Certainly as the adult and as a system or a school, removing excess attention from that student would be critical. That again may mean removing students from the room. If possible, if this is a lunchroom type of situation, it may be necessary to clear the lunchroom. Otherwise, you are then likely using some kind of restraint technique to remove that student from the lunchroom. And again, local decision, part of your crisis planning. But if seclusion or restraint is used, again, at that peak phase, that documentation and reporting will need to occur. So additional strategies as you see students beginning to de-escalate, just maintaining that conscientiousness of proximity, keeping that student who's coming out of the peak phase away from other students and adults if at all possible, maybe just providing a quiet space for that student, not necessarily one that would be identified as seclusion, but just a quiet space. Do not force the student to talk, according to Colvin's research, or to look you in the eye at this point or admit mistakes. This could cause escalation back into the peak phase again. So this de-escalation is about removing excess attention, providing a safe environment to just come down from that peak and not having to answer a number of questions right away or look folks in the eye, etc. In recovery, which is the last of the 7 phases in Colvin's research, within recovery, the student displays an eagerness to engage in other activities now and is attempting to correct the problem himself or herself. There may still be an unwillingness to participate in group activities. The student may be very tired after being in that peak phase, so there may be some social withdrawal, or frankly, there may be an opportunity where that student just needs to rest or potentially sleep for a short period of time. As that next bullet states, as I've already stated, just may be very common for a student to be tired during this phase. And so part of your crisis plan or your planning around this may be, what does that look like? Where does that student go? How do we re-engage that student in an appropriate manner after recovery is in place? Strategies, certainly at some point, depending on what the situation was, there should be follow through with consequences for the problem behavior. It's just the manner of how and that interaction with the student, but certainly that follow through is important. Positively reinforce any displays of appropriate behavior as that student de-escalates and enters that recovery phase. You may see those attempts to correct, though you may see some re-engagement, and so positively reinforcing that as you see it. And then the intervention side of things from a teacher standpoint is slowly beginning to reestablish routines and activities with that student after that peak has occurred, the de-escalation and then recovery. So feel free to go back through this and revisit some of the phases. But again, under the ESI regulations, there's this idea of providing a very basic overview of some de-escalation prevention strategies. And we felt using Colvin's research helped to provide an example of what the phases look like by definition, and what are some things that maybe I help you identify what phase a student is in, recognizing very importantly that peak is where seclusion or restraint may be necessary. If that occurs, reporting and documenting that incident is critical to the ESI regulations, and having some type of sense of some different interventions or de-escalation or prevention strategies that could be used at each of these phases, whether a student goes through all 7 or stops at agitation or acceleration. The last thing we have is just some kind of overarching prevention of power struggles out of Colvin's work. From an adult standpoint, we just always have to think about choosing the right time. There's the expression, pick your battles, those types of expressions, choosing the right time to try and visit with students, maintaining that idea of proximity. Sometimes more important how we address the manner than how we address the matter versus what is actually in play. Starting off positive and praising students and maintaining that. Think to yourself, if I were the student, would I want to listen to myself as the teacher? So thinking about what is being said, especially if the student begins to cycle through these 7 phases. Staying calm, or at least appearing calm, certainly with a classroom full of kids or a lunchroom, in situations where peak may be reached. Other adults are going to look to you. Certainly students are going to look to you for someone who's going to be calm, or certainly at least appear calm, to provide the appropriate intervention at that phase. It is very difficult for adults to, quote, win power struggles with students. You know that likely if you have never taught a day in your life, or if you are a 35-year classroom veteran teacher, that it is very rare that adults ever win power struggles with students. And so just remembering that going into potential situations where there's agitation, acceleration, a peak, some strategies, just thinking about taking small steps with students. Don't forget to laugh. Humor can be a good prevention strategy, a de-escalation strategy. Sarcasm probably doesn't fit there well, but certainly don't forget the humor. Teach and reinforce with all kids to mind their own business, mind your own business. If there are situations that arise and students need to be removed from a classroom so that the other student who's potentially approaching peak can cycle through that, just teaching that environment to students of minding their own business, which may help if there's a situation that needs to occur where all the other students are asked to step out. Not jumping to conclusions, just understanding that this type of cycle of acting out has phases to it, and being able to help students through those phases, which may include the use of seclusion or restraint to keep that student safe from himself, herself, or others. Always being conscientious of your audience, and again, making that determination if students need to be asked to step out. What is the local crisis plan in a situation like that? You may yourself need a minute to cool down, which is where proximity and your nonverbal is really important. It may be necessary, especially if you have a para in the classroom working with you as a teacher. You may need to just step out and cool down for a moment. If a situation begins to feel like there's a trigger, there's agitation, there's acceleration, just don't be afraid to walk away for a moment. Final reminder on that idea of proximity and personal space. And then last reminder from Colvin's work, don't take the bait. It's not about you as the educator. So knowing maybe some of the inner workings of these 7 phases of acting out, what that cycling looks like, we feel can help with this idea of basic prevention de-escalation strategies. So feel free to go back through this PowerPoint to review any of the phases that you'd like to review. And with that said, we will conclude, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.